Hey, detoxers. Welcome to a special episode of the Disinfo Detox. There's been a lot of talk in the United States over the last week or so following the assassination of Charlie Kirk about issues of empathy and citizenship and respect, and what role education has to play in all of this. Well, I'm lucky enough to be joined by someone who can talk about these critical issues and has been doing this work for quite some time. Scott Jamieson of Inspire Citizens. Welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Hi, Nolan. It's great to have a chance to chat with you. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's been way too long. I'm trying to think of, it's probably been a couple years since I was on your podcast, which we're definitely going to plug here today. But a big supporter of Inspire Citizens. I think you guys have taken on a Herculean effort here, and it's clearly needed in this time period, certainly. Can you tell folks a little bit about what Inspire Citizens does and what's your mission over there?
For sure. Our mission really centers around global citizenship. And it all really started with Sustainable Development Target 4.7, which is education for sustainable development for global citizenship and sustainability. And thinking about how we can help schools to implement this kind of work into their programs from a systemic level, like looking at whole school programs, and then thinking about how do we support the school to be able to build capacity for teachers to lead some of this work, which is probably different than they've been asked to do in the past, as we are working with an ever evolving world. And also do some work with students around student leadership and designing projects to have a positive impact in the community. So it really comes back to this big idea of global citizenship, and whether that's service learning or community engagement or student leadership, but looking at ways where we can apply our learning in a meaningful way to have a positive impact in the world and make the world just a little bit better, and working towards that aspirational future that we all want to live in.
Okay, let's say I'm the playing the part of the old school curmudgeon here. So with all this talk about global citizenship and education, what's the benefit to my kid who's in one of these schools, and what's the benefit to my life of having more folks educated in this global citizenship?
I think it adds meaning to education. A lot of times as a teacher, I spend a lot of time in the classroom and as a school administrator, and we get questions like, when am I ever going to use this? Or what is the purpose of learning this? And if we have a good answer for that, well, we're going to use this in a project we're doing with this community partner that is going to allow us to apply our learning in a meaningful way. I think we build engagement, we build agency, and we allow students to really take ownership of their learning. And it's also what makes students stand out. If we think about applying to really the next step beyond school is moving on to post-secondary, and schools are looking for smart students, obviously, but they're also looking for interesting students. And this is the kind of work that makes students interesting when they are working in some of these real world situations and being able to have stories to tell when they're writing their essays and talking a little bit about themselves, about some of the work they do, and hopefully finding something that they're passionate about, something that resonates with them, something that they really care about, to allow them to maybe even take that to the next step for their next stage of their learning, or even as a career. So just really giving students an opportunity to find what they're passionate about, and creating space for them to design projects that kind of follow that lead, and think about how we apply all these things that we're learning in the school, but do that in a real world context. And again, we talk about learning that transfers and being able to take your learning and apply that in a unique situation. And this is a great opportunity for kids to do that. So I think it's really about creating this sort of idea of the whole child, and building around not just looking at those academic or those test scores, but thinking about what else kind of rounds that out, and what else kind of helps our students, and how do we empower them, how do we give them those skills and knowledge and dispositions to create opportunities for them to be successful, and also kind of guide them along the way, as and we're not always successful. Being a change maker is difficult work. How are we learning from some of the things that we're doing to continue to grow as a global citizen throughout the course of our time in school?
Yeah, and I want one of the things that I know you emphasize that I want to talk about here today, and I mentioned in the introduction, is this concept of empathy, which I know is something that you focus on a lot in your work, and I focused on in Let's Agree. And as I mentioned, here in the United States, I think we're having I don't know, a crisis of a dearth of empathy, if you will, in that following the assassination of Charlie Kirk, I think a lot of folks on the right pointed out there seemed to be a lack of empathy for the now childless children of Charlie Kirk or his wife, and there were those on the left who argued that there seemed to be a dearth of empathy for people who were hurt by the rhetoric of Charlie Kirk. And so I think there's clearly a conversation about empathy happening without anybody talking about empathy or being empathetic. And so I want to have you on the program for that kind of reason. Talk to us about empathy, and maybe for folks who don't know what it is, if you can kind of explain it to them and what role it plays in the work you do.
I think empathy is so important. It's a disposition, really, being able to really understand other people. And that's something that is definitely a challenge in a lot of places in the world, and something that has really kind of rose to the surface with this latest tragedy in the United States. And definitely a lack of empathy, I think, on both sides of this conversation that you've highlighted here. And how are we as educators, how do we build that from the ground up as kind of a grassroots level? And I think it's really kind of connecting from the heart when we're learning. And our framework we use is called empathy to impact. And it's really about the head, the heart, and the hands. So thinking about what it is that we really care about in the world. And there's a lot of things we might be caring about. They might be to do with the welfare of people and thinking about social justice issues, perhaps. It might be an environmental sustainability lens. It might be well-being in our community. It might be looking at a more circular model of economics. There's so many different ways and so many different things we can care about as we think about kind of working towards an aspirational future. And how do we start from a place of empathy with all of our learning and to help our students engage with something they care about? So our 4 steps to the process is care, aware, able, and impact. So we start out with care and thinking about what are these big issues that imagine like a concept that we're designing learning around. And then how do we become more deeply aware? And you and I have talked a lot about this in the past, and being able to really get in deep in an issue, to be systems thinkers and be critical thinkers and strategic thinkers and ethical thinkers, and unpacking an issue from all the different sides. I remember one of our first conversations, you talked about an assignment that you gave to your students where they weren't asked to form an opinion on something. They were asked to uncover all of the different perspectives that are around this issue and to understand that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we find that? By looking at all these different perspectives and being able to understand. And this is something I think, again, we've talked about a lot with, let's agree to disagree. And we've lost the ability to have civil discourse. We've lost the ability to productively disagree. And we have a hard time moving forward if we can't productively disagree, when it becomes, we become enemies on either side, when really, if we kind of imagine a Venn diagram where we have those 2 circles and we have those 2 viewpoints, and on just about every issue, I'm sure there is something in that little overlapping space that we might be able to move forward in terms of action. So we talked about we have care, we have aware. Now thinking about able, like these are the skills and knowledge and dispositions that we're going to need in order to be able to think about action and be able to have a positive impact. But really taking that to an action step and allowing our students to have space, whether that's through advocacy, whether that's through directly working with different communities, whether that's through research and kind of putting all these pieces together. I think this gives students an opportunity to develop empathy, to have conversations and meet different people from different walks of life or from different communities with different perspectives. And if we can start having those conversations at young ages and recognizing that we're really all in this together and that it's okay to disagree and we can have different opinions. But if we have just sort of rules of engagement with those kind of conversations where we have a safe space and we're able to disagree productively, I think this is where we've really, and again, we can point a lot of fingers, whether it's social media and just how fast the hateful messages travel versus good news, or just the ability, how easy it is to sort of put a spin on things. And we've seen that a lot in the last week as well, again, surrounding this horrible tragedy. where these messages are coming out with some political motivation but in a lot of cases, just from not a very nice place. And I think if we stop and actually have a conversation, I think we are going to realize that everybody agrees that this was a horrible situation. Everyone agrees that this was a tragedy, regardless of what you think about his opinion or how he lived his life. When anyone loses his life in this kind of way and leaves a family behind, like, it's awful. And I think the majority of people in a conversation, just like we're having right now, would come to that consensus, I would hope. And I think if we build those tools and competencies and understanding different perspectives with students from a young age and kind of work that through, and being able to kind of be in safe spaces within school, they disagree productively and think about an action step beyond kind of a debate for a blue ribbon. I think that can be really productive and really meaningful for kids.
Yeah, really, really good point. And I think something that kind of comes to mind as you're saying that is I think about the screen and how, I don't know, there's something about the screen, it seems to kill empathy. Like I have to imagine no person would want to have been in that audience where Charlie Kirk was and had a bullet fly over their head. Or, unfortunately, I watched the video. I'm not going to give the details, but watch what we saw in that video in real time and in front of you. I think most people would think that. I think if you told most people, just without naming the name or the political ideology, if you said, "Hey, someone was shot on a college campus," I think they would, clutch their pearls and be like, "Oh my God." But for some reason, you throw in the screen, you throw in social media, you throw in the character, and all of a sudden now it's almost like this trivial game. What role do you think the screen plays? Do you think it undermines empathy? Is there hope for empathy in the kind of digital connected world?
I want to believe there's hope. And I think that does exist through off screen connection. I think we saw that during the pandemic. Students were really struggling with mental health, with their well being. Everybody was, because of that lack of personal connection. I think we're designed to be connected. And what's always ironic about technology is that we're never been more connected, but at the same time, we've never been less connected. And I think it just is very easy. And I think there's also, like, thinking about the algorithms that tend to push you into camp A or camp B. And because of that, you sort of have a package set of, well, this is what this group believes, and this is what this group believes. So if you're looking at a lot of complex issues, like firearms in the United States, like reproductive rights, these are two very, very separate issues. But if you're part of one camp or the other, then you sort of have to be, you sort of get the whole package. And we've lost our ability to kind of be critical thinkers about each of those pieces. And what is my stance on those? And is it okay if I agree with this and don't agree with that? Like, how it doesn't fit anymore in the boxes that I think the social media platforms put us in. And I think it's also just how easy it is and how to be able to do something that we probably would have a really hard time doing face to face. The screen is sort of that sort of protective layer, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And as I hear you talking, I'm also thinking about the critics out there who might say, okay, Scott, you're talking about all these politically charged issues, things that are very important to students. Are you another one of those teachers that's kind of just dogmatically socializing these students and your political views? How do you navigate this minefield without becoming dogmatic, Scott?
It's challenging for sure. I think we do have to understand that teachers are under the microscope these days. And parents have certain expectations, and everything happens pretty fast. I remember another conversation that we had in the past about comments that you make in class to prompt discussion, if taken out of context, could easily cause a lot of problems. And I think it's really making sure that we have those open lines of communication, to whether it's through parent coffees or really kind of designing programs that involve our whole school communities, where our parents are important stakeholders in the work. And the more we can kind of bring everybody in and have that sort of shared understanding and shared language around, it probably comes back to the mission of our school. Like, we've got language in terms of our mission, our vision, our core values. And understanding that if you're joining a school, that's what you're coming into. and that this is what these terms mean when we talk about global citizenship. Are we talking about intercultural understanding? Or if we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has become a really difficult topic in the United States at the moment. And understanding, just making sure that we have those open lines of communication. And I think helping our parents understand that, we're listeners as well. Like we want to understand, have their feedback, and that it matters. And the same thing goes for students. Like the more we can kind of build trust and build community and create a sense of unity and belonging around the work we're trying to do, I think that really helps to bring people on board. And, I think there's a lot of finger pointing sometimes with, a lot of education institutions tend to lean a little bit left and tend to be a little bit more progressive. But they understand that, even if that's the case, like we need to value everybody's perspective. We need to value everybody's opinion, and just creating, like I say, those safe spaces where we can have those productive discussions and thinking about how we can move forward on issues rather than just getting stuck in the opposite camps, like the Hatfields and the McCoys. Like how do we build a bridge?
I was born in the state of Kentucky, so that one resonates with me. You have another project coming out too. I want to make sure folks know about. It's called Literacy for a Complex World. So, what is this project? What's going on here?
Really excited about this. This is something that I'm working on with our director at Inspire Citizens, Aaron Moniz, and our good friend Stacy Stevens, and recognizing that we don't think the schools do enough for media literacy in school. It doesn't exist as a separate class, and there's a hope that it kind of is integrated around our programs, but teachers don't often have the resources and the support to be able to help our kids to navigate the complex media landscape that they're finding themselves in. And we think about how difficult it is for us as adults to process some of the things that come across our feeds. And then take that down to like a fourth grader who probably has a phone these days and is probably scrolling through Instagram or YouTube or TikTok or some things that old people like me don't even know about yet. And thinking about how do we help them to separate what's real from what's not and be critical and be curious about, are these reliable sources? So we developed Literacy for a Complex World, and we're just rolling that out with some of our school partners around the world. And it really comes down to three pillars of access, how we're getting into the media we're consuming, and how are we evaluating sources? How are we being critical thinkers? How are we really kind of probing to see if something is fact or not? Then thinking about understanding. So from access to understand, and helping us to understand. It's overwhelming, all these different perspectives that we're seeing. How do we make sense of that? And then finally, to be not just consumers, but creators of media. And thinking about apply and act is our third pillar. And having students be media creators to celebrate and share and showcase their learning with a larger audience. You think about an essay, which has an audience of probably one. A student's writing, their teacher reads it, and that's kind of the end of the story. But we can hit all of those literacy standards with a media piece. And that can be pushed out through our school's social media channels. That can be pushed out to our parent community. That can be helping to educate and also share a call to action on an issue that students are passionate about. I think media has so much power in school to be able to help us to move forward. And so we're just developing a framework of where that fits in school. How does that connect to your literacy standards? How does that connect to your social studies standards? And we've done some work to map that to some of the different standards that are used in schools, and just a way to help teachers to be more purposeful and understand the power of media. And we think it's more engaging for students. We think it's more relevant for students when we can take this maybe new approach to literacy learning. And we do live in a complex world. And I think as educators, we need to be adaptive. And I think if we can help educators to have some resources for the how of that, I think we understand the why, we understand what this is all about, but how is where schools often get stuck. And if we can kind of help teachers and give them the support they need, we're going to start to see this happening in classrooms and see students to becoming more media literate as we work through school. And that's really something that I think is essential.
I totally agree. And Scott, I want to commend you. You're one of those interesting folks who I don't talk to for a year or two. We can pick up right where we left off. And I think the work you're doing is critically important. Right now, I think there's a lot of people who are desperate for solutions. They're fixated on problems, but here you are creating and implementing solutions all around the world. So appreciate it, Scott. Tell folks where they can follow your work so they can get involved.
Absolutely. You can find us at inspirecitizens.org. Our webpage is full of free resources as well as some stories about what this work looks like in schools, probably just like the one you teach in if you're an educator, or maybe if you're looking, as curious parents, what this might look like. We've got some stories. We also have a podcast called Empathy to Impact, and it features students from around the world who are engaged in this kind of learning. And we go right to the client and students. We create a platform for students to tell their story and share some of their work with a larger audience, just exactly like we're talking about here, using media to inspire and using media to celebrate and using media to help showcase some of this important work. And you can find me on LinkedIn, Scott Jamieson, Inspire Citizens. Pretty easy to find there as well. I would love to have a conversation if you want to reach out and learn a little bit more. We are always happy to have a chat and collaborate.
Scott Jamieson, powerful stuff. Thank you so much for coming on the Disinfo Detox.
Thanks, Nolan. It's been great to be here. Really admire your work, and I think this is important. We've got to be thinking about media literacy and appreciate the work you do and the platforms you've created to share this work. So thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Detoxers, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.